Thank you, Treasurer. I've been said a lot recently that the current government is engaging more with people out there doing business than has been done in the most recent past, so thank you again for that. My question's actually in two parts. This morning we had a discussion about engineering being more and more part of manufacturing and a dominant value add of manufacturing. We talked about small business getting its business from large projects, large infrastructure projects, and evolves and learns and grows and moves into future technologies. Given all that, how would you describe the proposition that the submarine/naval shipbuilding has no future in Australia? And what could we expect and how can we help you to voice some opinions on that? Be the first question. The second one, I detect in your speech that there's some sort of tension between the states and the federal government.
You're very perceptive.
Yeah, I'm not normally known for my perception, but given that, what perhaps you can just give us an idea of what you think's at the heart of that, and given that it is a community for development, what would be the constructive way forward in that dialogue?
Well, on the first point, our defence industries, might I say that we identified 6 industries that we saw as being historically great enablers for growth in the Victorian economy, and defence and materials construction were seen as being one of those key industries. One of the things we've been very keen to do is to engage other states in the idea of cooperative advocacy for our quality domestic produced product. Our view is, of course, we don't have to compete with the other states. We have respective centres of excellence, things that we can do, whether it's shipbuilding or submarine building, whether it's componentry supply, and indeed whether it's land-based vehicles for the purposes of support in the defence effort. So we think that a lot can be done together. Importantly, we've allocated money in the budget for the establishment of a Defence Procurement Office. That is a office that will be based in Geelong. Its job will be to assist the state of Victoria advocate for Victorian industry as a great provider for the defence industry and our right to effectively assert ourselves for the purposes of delivering key defence materials. I want to make the point that I think I'm quite concerned about where I think the federal government is going on the submarine, the upcoming submarine bid. I think anybody who's seen the varying positions that come out of the federal government that would get a pretty clear feel that a deal of sorts seems to have been done with Japan. I don't think any of the states can responsibly or effectively sit down and let that occur. And componentry assembly will not be a satisfactory consolation prize in this space. We've put a lot of investment into building up the skills and the capacities in our defence industry. They're great enablers for skills that have wider utilisation right across our supply chain. So if the future of manufacturing is about finding the appropriate niche in the supply chain, then it's also about making sure that we've got adequate skills to support that aspiration. And quite frankly, if we lose our defence industries, if we lose the lion's share of capacity build, our state will be worse off, but our nation will be worse off in the long term. We can't afford to lose this together with our vehicle manufacturing industry. Oh, federal government, and how do we overcome this impasse? The first point I'd make about the federal government is they are unpredictable. It's really hard to get a feel on what they're saying one day to the next. But to simply demonstrate the point, can I make the observation that last night letters were received from the Federal Transport Minister, Warren Truss, to the government saying, well, we're recalling funds, $1.5 billion of funds in the 15-16 budget, and we're open to discuss with you about the idea of alternative projects, subject to the receipt of an appropriate business case. And there wasn't a hint of irony when he mentioned the idea of an appropriate business case, which I found somewhat amusing. But today, under questioning, we hear that the Federal Finance Minister broadly doesn't know where Melbourne is, let alone our road network. And we have a Federal Treasurer who, under very mild questioning, pretty much well acknowledged that, well, you know, we want the $1.5 billion back, but we'll give it back to Victoria for the Western Distributor, which is a project that's currently working its way through value assessment. We've got a negotiation to undertake, and we're yet to be satisfied that the taxpayer gets value from it. So this idea of jumping off one horse onto another, I think is fundamentally destructive. And this idea that you can surprise the state of Victoria and the people of Victoria with an attack which is nothing more than an exercise in fiscal attack upon the state of Victoria, I think that creates an enormous level of uncertainty. But can I say that my position, the position of the state of Victoria, is we're not going to engage in the hectoring rhetoric that has been directed at us. I think people require grown-up government. Can I use the language of the previous, well, the current government as they were aspiring to be a government? Grown-up government actually means that we don't overreact in the face of what are unreasonable and, quite ridiculous interventions in what should be seen as a commitment to building infrastructure in a cooperative way. I'm going to continue to work with the federal government. We will continue to work with the federal government. We won't be voluntarily handing back any funds to the federal government. We take it as our responsibility to work positively with the federal government, but if they want to punish the people of Victoria for the way they voted at the last election, despite the fact that the Prime Minister described it as a referendum on a particular road, a referendum that people spoke pretty emphatically about, given that it was front and centre of the last campaign, if the level of animosity directed at the Victorian people to the extent of $122 each to subsidise the rest of the nation is something they want to carry through on, well, so be it, but we will fight it every step of the way. Not in the allocation of histrionics and vitriol directed at them, just in the sense that we'll fight them by carrying on as a responsible, reasonable government, trying to look after the interests of this state.
Treasurer, first of all, thank you for your presentation, very clear. My name's Dean Economou from NICTA. I saw in your presentation you indicated that some money's allocated to increasing efficiency of the transport system. NICTA's got a strong presence in Victoria, and we love the technology of doing more with less, so I'd be really interested if you could elaborate on that part of your presentation.
Sure. Please don't get me started on intelligent transport systems and transport efficiency. It's an area that I think I could bore for Australia on. It's also an area that I don't think, unfortunately, we spend enough time thinking about. Quite often the solution for every problem is a big infrastructure spend, rather than recognising that we've got a lot of sunk investment in infrastructure that could be utilised much more efficiently. The previous government, under a visionary roads minister, might I say, produced what was called an intelligent transport system, and I'm pleased to say that we've got the International ITS conference here in Melbourne, because we're seen as a world leader in this technology. You've just come, great. This technology is critically important to managing and to sweating the asset of our sunk investment. So smart roads, smarter utilisation of our road space, whether it's the use of ramp technology or lane use management systems, whether it's the use of digital tachograph technology in in our truck systems so that we can actually see where they're going and at what speed they're going and the wear on the network. All of these things are important, but also recognising the use, the utility and value that particular elements of our road network are being applied to. So are we making the investment in the right places for the usage that would likely occur on our road network? That's what Smart Roads is about. It's about smart investment, and it's also about recognising that we're a world leader in developing this technology here in Victoria. So we're putting, I think from memory, about $90 million into this area. And the reason we're doing it is we think that we actually will garner a much greater return for Victorians than perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in a single piece of infrastructure upgrade. If you think about it, the M1 upgrade increased the throughput and carrying capacity of that piece of the arterial road network by 50%, effectively by not only increasing the infrastructure that was associated with the ramping technologies, but also the ramp metering and the lane use management. That sort of thing could be applied right across our freeway network. That sort of thing, I think, is where Victoria can be a world leader, and in many ways it demonstrates that we get much better value for our already sunk assets.
Treasurer Chris Leptos from Flagstaff. Could you tell us what's the future of payroll tax under an Andrews government? Are we ever going to see payroll tax disappear?
Disappear? Don't mention that, Chris, with me halfway through eating something. But I suppose at the end of the day, we do need to recognise that governments need the wherewithal to provide the services and the infrastructure that the state expects. We also need to recognise that to the extent that governments can, they should not be an undue burden upon business in terms of their capacity to employ. So the previous Labor government reduced payroll tax on 7 separate occasions. I think we brought payroll tax down by 17 times more than the previous Conservative government did. They had one paltry reduction, I think, of 0.025%. So we made it part and parcel of everything we did. We will continue to look at how we can reduce the burden of tax upon business, because we recognise that it gives business a greater capacity to employ. But do we have any plans to remove payroll tax? I've got to say, short of removing either our hospital or our education system, Chris, no.
Good afternoon, Honourable Tim Pallas. Thank you very much for your presentation. Patrick Conron from Technology One. There's been a lot of work done by the previous Liberal government around the whole of government IT strategy and digitalisation and transformation. Can you just give some views around the importance of that to you, and if there's been any funds allocated to that in this budget?
Well, can I say IT is one of the great challenges that confronts not only governments but the private sector. There have been enormous graveyards of careers where IT projects have been considered and ultimately have well and truly expanded beyond their initial scope and cost. So we're going to tread carefully. I understand the Auditor-General is looking into this space, and presumably at some point we'll hear from him about how well IT systems and IT processes have been managed. But I think the idea that we need to recognise that you can't just turn your back on IT, and we need to have increasing levels of informed purchaser capacities within the state around IT procurement. Without it, we run the risk, I think, essentially of just continuing the mistakes of the past. I will make this point that unless and until we're satisfied that IT projects stack up, we won't be heading down the path of entering into new IT projects. I think our view very clearly is that far too often there's been an overabundance and over-enthusiasm around the acquisition of IT, and that overabundance has actually cost the state of Victoria dearly. And it doesn't matter what government's in power. We didn't see much action happen from the registration and licensing system over the last 4 years from the previous government. It's because ultimately they didn't know how to do it, and because far too often we try to create bespoke products when we don't need to. And from a government point of view, from a Treasury point of view, I'll be very clear, I think we need to concentrate our efforts a lot more on amending our process to meet off-the-shelf products rather than moving towards trying to be world leaders and great innovators in an area where, quite frankly, we haven't, no government has covered themselves in any great glory. So understanding what it is we want, having the expertise within government to assist us at a central and procurement level, I think will be important for us. But we won't be rushing into entering into IT agreements that are bespoke into the future, because I think the taxpayer's got every right to question whether or not they've got value for money on past performance.
This is Simon DeBell from Assia Brown Bavaria, a global power and automation company. We've been operating in Victoria now for over 50 years. When we look at both energy policy and infrastructure investment, we recognise the need to have constancy of purpose between governments of different political persuasions. One of the challenges that we've seen is the lack of bipartisan support for various policy initiatives. So we're interested to understand from this government's perspective how you'll seek to rebuild that bipartisan support for the major programs you talked about.
I think three ways. Thanks very much, Simon, for the question. Three things that we need to do to ensure that we can build bipartisan support. First, we've got to rebuild trust in the business of politics. And that is that politicians have got to say what they mean and do what they say. That's why we put so much weight and emphasis into honouring our commitments. Now, of course, we'll be nibbled at the edges about whether or not we said something that or did something that was entirely word perfect with what we intend, but I think people can have a fair degree of confidence that the things we said we would do, we will actually do. And we say that because we need to rebuild confidence in the political system and structure. Secondly, I'm not one to believe that governments or politicians should export their responsibility to ultimately make decisions and to govern, but I am very strongly of the view that we need to have a greater debate about where our big investments are being made, particularly in infrastructure, and try and build a public awareness and consensus around those decisions. That's why the government will be introducing legislation into the Parliament to establish Infrastructure Victoria, an independent body that will look at and prioritise our infrastructure spend. They will produce cost-benefit analysis, they will produce business cases, and they will determine what of that information, hopefully as much as possible, can be put into the public domain for the purposes of a debate and hopefully the development of a political consensus around these things in the long term. I'm not advocating that politicians ultimately should exculpate themselves from their responsibilities to govern. What I'm saying is that they should open themselves up to the bright light of scrutiny, informed scrutiny, and informed public debate about the things that we're doing. That's why we were so keen to put into the public domain the idea of the Western distributor, so that Victorians could see this is on the cards. We didn't want the first thing that you knew about it was us signing contracts or intentions to create contracts or whatever else. A broader public debate about the merit of these things are important. But at the end of the day, politicians have to decide and they have to hold themselves accountable for the choices they made against a well-informed backdrop of debate. And the third thing I think is increasingly important is to rebuild trust. We have to make sure that we've got professional levels of project delivery. so that we are not just simply talking about a theoretical body by which infrastructure is prioritised. Government develops a centre of excellence by which infrastructure can be managed. The community have greater confidence around the processes under which infrastructure is identified, prioritised and managed. And might I say design, because design of infrastructure increasingly in a built urban environment will become a matter of great topicality the further we go on. So building up systems, building up processes by which the community is greater engaged, and politicians understanding that when you go into this business, it's not about fooling as many people as you can to get elected. It's about making sure that the things that you really value are the things that you're advocating for, and if you get elected, get ahead and do them.
Good afternoon, Mr Treasurer. My name's Chris Stoltz. I represent Engineers Australia. And firstly, thanks very much. We noticed in the budget papers that you propose an Office of the Chief Engineer and also Infrastructure Victoria. So thank you. My question relates to NBN. We heard earlier this morning that there are some job opportunities that could be created in Victoria that are held back by the lack of high-speed broadband. And also building the NBN provides an opportunity to employ people, particularly in areas, say, like Geelong. Is there anything, do you think, that the Victorian Government could do to help NBN bring forward its construction plans for the NBN in Victoria?
Well, there are some things that we can do, and certainly the federal government has a series of programs where we can identify communities that are particularly adversely affected by existing infrastructure or broadband, poor provision of broadband, let me put it that way, and how we might be able to improve that. There are capacities for the state to seek to partner with the Commonwealth and leverage those investments. But in a broader sense, I think the issue for us is, well, this is an area of federal government responsibility. Interestingly, I'm not a commentator at large on all of the areas that the federal government perform. I might say that's not a luxury that my federal Treasury equivalent accords me. He does consider himself a commentator at large on the state of Victoria. It's good to see him down here every now and then. The point I would make is I don't particularly like the model the federal government have identified. I think it's a sub-optimal product, but nonetheless, it would be good to see some substantive progress made. We're always happy to work with local communities in advocating for areas of shortfall. We're also keen to work with the federal government, including identifying those areas where priority should be given towards the rollout of the NBN. I think in terms of a business context, there is no doubt that the NBN holds great opportunity for Victoria. I mean, we've got some of the smartest IT and gaming product deliverers in the world. We've got a great capacity, if only we can effectively link up those businesses, those ideas with each other and access to their markets. So an effective high-speed broadband is critical. Given that Victoria as a community is a state that basically gets its greatest value out of the diligence, the skills and the capacity of its people, that's our biggest and best product. I think, therefore, that the broadband will open us up even further to the world, so anything that we can do in encouraging the rapid rollout of the NBN, I think is a good thing.
With that, I'd like to extend a vote of thanks on behalf of CEDA members to the Treasurer, the Honourable Tim Pallas. Thank you, Tim.